The knock came at the wrong door. Caleb Mercer heard it and didn't move. Nobody knocked on his door. Nobody had knocked on his door in 18 years. He stood in the middle of his kitchen with a coffee cup halfway to his mouth and told himself it was the wind. Then it came again, 3 hard raps, deliberate and real, and he set the cup down slow because his hand had started to shake. When he opened the door, a woman stood in the rain holding a letter with his name on it. He had never written that letter. If this story already has you hooked, subscribe to our channel right now and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The cattle needed feeding at 5 in the morning, same as always. Caleb Mercer didn't need an alarm. His body had learned the hour the way a fence post learns the ground, not by choice, but by pressure, applied long enough that it becomes permanent. He was up before the sky turned gray boots on, before his eyes adjusted, coat pulled over his shoulders, while his breath made small clouds in the cold air of the cabin. He didn't light the lamp right away. He hadn't bothered with that in years. There was nobody to light it for. 18 years was a long time to live the same day. He knew that. He wasn't a fool. He'd done the counting once, laid flat on his back one winter night, when the snow made the roof groan and the silence got so thick it had weight, and he'd worked out the number. 6,570 days, give or take. He stopped counting after that. Numbers made it worse. What he knew was this: the cattle came first, then the fences, then whatever was broken, which was always something. And then night came back down, and he slept, and the whole thing started over. He didn't eat breakfast most mornings, not a real one. Coffee, sometimes a piece of hardtack or leftover cornbread if he'd bothered to make it. Food was fuel. He'd stopped thinking of it as anything else. His neighbor Hector Reyes had ridden out 3 weeks ago with a pot of his wife's chili and set it on the table without asking. Caleb had let him in, let him sit, let him talk. Hector had said something about a church social in Clearwater, something about a widow named Mrs. Aldrich, who'd asked after Caleb specifically. Caleb had said, "Thank her for me." Hector had looked at him for a long moment. "She's a real nice woman, Caleb." "I'm sure she is. She makes a fine apple cake. Good for her." Hector had finished his coffee and ridden home. He hadn't come back since. People generally stopped coming back eventually. Caleb had made a kind of peace with that. He was out at the east fence line just past noon when the storm started coming in from the north. He could read weather the way some men read scripture, not because he wanted to, but because it kept him alive. The sky had gone the color of a bruise somewhere past the ridge, and the wind had that particular bite that meant serious business before dark. He'd started back toward the barn when he heard the wagon. He stopped walking. He wasn't expecting anyone. He never expected anyone. The road to Mercer Ridge broke off from the main trail 3 miles outside Clearwater, and nobody took it by accident. It was rutted and steep, and the rock face on the north side had claimed 2 wagon wheels that he knew of, both belonging to people who had enough sense not to try it twice. But there was a wagon coming up that road. He could hear it before he could see it, the creak of wood and the labored sound of a horse working harder than it wanted to. He stood and waited because there was nothing else to do. The wagon cleared the last rise and came into the flat yard in front of the cabin, and the horse stopped on its own sides, heaving, breath streaming. The driver was a man he didn't recognize, young with a hat pulled low and the look of someone who had been on the road since before dawn and wasn't happy about any of it. And there was a woman in the bed of the wagon. She was climbing down before the driver could offer a hand, which told Caleb something about her right away. She landed both feet on the ground and straightened up and looked directly at him, and she did not look the way he'd expected. He hadn't known what to expect, but not this. She was soaked through. Her coat was brown wool, and it had gone dark with rain. Her hair was coming loose from whatever arrangement it had started the day in, and there was mud on her boots up past the ankle. She was carrying a traveling bag in one hand and a folded piece of paper in the other, and her jaw was set in a way that meant she'd been holding something in for a long time. She walked toward him across the yard with the rain starting to come down in earnest now, and she looked at him the way a person looks at a landmark they've been told to find. She said, "Are you Caleb Mercer?" He said, "I am." She held out the paper. "Then I believe you sent for me." He didn't take it right away. He looked at her face first. She was young, much younger than him, with dark eyes that were tired but not beaten. There was something careful in the way she was holding herself, the kind of careful that comes from managing something fragile on the inside while keeping the outside steady. He took the paper. He unfolded it. He read it once. Then he read it again. It was a letter. His name was at the top, written in a hand he didn't recognize. Mr. Caleb Mercer, Mercer Ridge, Utah Territory. The body of the letter was 3 paragraphs direct, plain spoken, the kind of language a working man might use. It described a ranch. It described a life of hard labor with fair conditions. It said a man of honest character was seeking a wife capable of sharing that life, and that he had written to the Fairfield Domestic Agency in Chicago in hope of a suitable match. His name was signed at the bottom. He had never written this letter. He looked up at her. She was watching him read. She hadn't moved. The rain was coming down harder now, and she hadn't flinched from it, which struck him as either very brave or very tired. He said, "Where did you get this?" "The agency." Her voice was steady. "They matched me to your letter in April. I've been traveling since the 14th, 11 days. From Chicago." "From Chicago." He folded the letter. His hands were very still. "Miss Whitfield, Clara Whitfield." "Miss Whitfield." He measured his next words carefully because he could see something fragile underneath the steadiness. Now something that could crack if he wasn't precise. "I did not write this letter." The driver of the wagon shifted on his seat. A harness buckle rattled. Clara Whitfield did not look away from him. She said very quietly, "I beg your pardon. I have never written to any agency. I have never sought a wife through correspondence or any other means." He held the letter out toward her. "I don't know where this came from, but it did not come from me." She did not take the letter. He could see her processing it, not falling apart, not erupting, just standing very still the way a person stands when the ground has moved and they are deciding whether it is going to move again. Then she said, "The agency was legitimate. I verified them myself. I spoke to 3 women who had placed through them. I don't doubt the agency." "Then what are you saying?" "I'm saying someone wrote this letter in my name, and I don't know who." The driver cleared his throat. "I can't wait out the storm, mister. Got a delivery run to Clearwater." Caleb looked at the sky. The storm had made up its mind now. The clouds had gone from bruised to black in the time since the wagon had arrived, and the wind was picking up cold and hard from the north. He knew this kind of storm. It would be down hard within the hour and ugly through the night. He looked at Clara Whitfield. She was looking back at him with those careful, tired eyes, and what he saw in them was not panic. It was something closer to anger that had been turned very low, like a burner kept just hot enough to cook on, but not hot enough to boil over. She was furious. She was just doing it quietly. He said, "You can't travel in this." "I'm aware. There's a room." He stopped. "A spare room." "I am not in a position to be choosy, Mr. Mercer." He nodded once, looked at the driver. "You'll want to move before it comes down hard." The driver didn't need to be told twice. He tipped his hat at Clara, turned the wagon, and was back down the road before Caleb could think of anything else to say. He and Clara Whitfield stood in the yard in the rain. She said, "I am not asking you to honor a letter you did not write." "Good. But I would appreciate not being turned out in a storm." "I said there was a room." She picked up her traveling bag. "Then let's go inside." He had not had anyone inside this cabin in a very long time. He was aware of it the moment he pushed the door open. Aware of the particular quality of the silence, the way it had settled into the corners and along the walls like dust. There were dishes stacked from 2 days ago. His coat from last week was hung over the back of a chair. The table had 2 stacks of ledger books and a broken bridle he'd been meaning to fix. He moved the ledgers, moved the coat. She stood in the doorway and took it in without comment, which he appreciated more than he could say. He put the coffee on because it was the only hospitable thing he knew how to do, and he stood at the stove with his back to her and listened to her set her bag down and pull out a chair and sit. She said, "Who would have written it?" He turned. "What? The letter. Who would have had reason to do that?" "I don't know yet." "But you're going to find out." It wasn't a question. He almost said, "That's not your concern," but stopped himself because it was her concern. She had traveled 11 days on the strength of that lie. Whatever she'd left behind in Chicago to make that trip, he didn't know what it was, but it had cost her something. He could see it in the way she held herself like someone carrying weight that wasn't supposed to show. He said, "Yes." She nodded once. He poured 2 cups of coffee and brought one to the table and set it in front of her. She wrapped both hands around it and didn't speak for a moment. Outside, the storm hit the roof like a curtain being dropped. She said, "The letter described this place very specifically. The ridge, the grazing land, the altitude." She looked at him. "Whoever wrote it knew you." That sat between them. He said, "Yes, they did." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down for the first time, and he put his hands flat on the table and thought. Not many people knew the details of Mercer Ridge. He'd kept to himself long enough that his neighbors knew the shape of his life without knowing much of its interior. Hector Reyes, the feed merchant in Clearwater, the man who ran the telegraph office, and Jonas Miller. Jonas had known him since before the 18 years, before the silence. Jonas had been the one who'd ridden out with him to set the first fence posts on this land, back when Caleb had believed that building something was a reason to stay alive. Jonas had been at the grave. Jonas had been the one who said quietly on that day, "You're going to want to come back to town eventually." Caleb never had, but Jonas still rode out once or twice a year, still sat in that chair that Clara Whitfield was sitting in now, still drank his coffee and talked enough for both of them. He said more to himself than to her Jonas Miller. Clara looked at him. Who is Jonas Miller? An old friend. A friend who would do this. He picked up his cup, put it down without drinking. "I don't know yet." She was watching him think, and she wasn't filling the silence with noise which he noticed. Most people couldn't sit in a silence like this one. She sat in it like she'd known worse. He said, "You sold everything to come here." It wasn't a question either. She looked at her coffee. "I sold what I had." Which was a pause. Just long enough to tell him it mattered. A boarding position, some furniture, a few books. She looked up. "Not much, but it was mine." He said nothing. She said, "I'm not telling you that to make you feel guilty. I'm telling you because you asked, and I intend to be honest with you even if the circumstances that brought me here were not." He looked at her. He had not been looked at, not really looked at, not as a person someone was paying attention to in a very long time. It had a particular quality to it that he couldn't name, like a sound too close after years of quiet. He said, "I'll be honest with you as well, Miss Whitfield. Clara." Clara. He let the name sit where it landed. This ranch has not had a second person in it for 18 years. I don't know how to be hospitable. I know how to work, and I know how to be quiet. If you stay until the storm passes, I will not trouble you." She said, "And when the storm passes?" He said, "I don't know yet." She looked at him for a long moment, then she said, "That may be the most honest thing anyone has said to me in a very long time." He almost said something. He let it go instead. She was up before him the next morning. He heard movement in the kitchen while it was still dark, and lay still for a moment trying to remember what it meant before his mind came fully awake. Then he remembered, and the strangeness of it hit him like cold water. There was another person in the house. When he came out, she had the fire going and was standing at the stove with the coffee pot in her hand. She was dressed for work, not for visiting, not for propriety, in a plain skirt and a heavy blouse, with her sleeves pushed up and her hair pinned back in a practical knot. She looked at him like he'd walked into a room she'd been in charge of for years. She said, "The coffee's nearly ready. I didn't know what you ate in the mornings, so I made cornbread. There were enough supplies." He stood in the kitchen doorway and didn't say anything for a moment. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." She set the pot down. But I was awake, and idle hands trouble me. He sat down at the table. She poured the coffee and set a plate down without ceremony and sat across from him. Not serving him, sitting with him. The distinction registered somewhere. He said, "The storm's passed. I heard the wind die around 4. You can make it to Clearwater today if you leave by mid-morning." She broke a piece of cornbread and didn't answer right away. He said, "The stage runs from Clearwater east twice a week. I'll give you money for the fare, whatever the agency paid you for travel." "They didn't pay me for travel," she said evenly. "I paid my own way." He stopped. She said, "The arrangement was that you would reimburse travel costs upon arrival." She looked at him steadily. "Which is a reasonable arrangement with a man who sent the letter. Less reasonable given the current circumstances." He said, "I'll still cover it." "Why?" "Because it's right." "You didn't create this situation." "No, but you suffered it. That's different." She looked at him for a long moment. There was something moving behind her eyes, not gratitude exactly. Something more complicated than gratitude, like a calculation being revised. She said, "I'd like to stay until you found out who wrote that letter." He hadn't expected that. "Why?" "Because whoever did it owes me an explanation, and I would like to be present when they give it." He couldn't argue with that. He wasn't sure he wanted to. He said, "It may take a few days." "Then it takes a few days. It'll mean staying here." "I'm aware of where I am, Mr. Mercer." He said, "Caleb." She looked at him. Something shifted very slightly in her expression. Not a smile, not quite. More like a door opening a fraction. She said, "Caleb," and went back to her coffee. She was in the barn by the time he'd finished his second cup. He hadn't asked her to go there. He hadn't suggested it. But when he walked out with the feed buckets, she was already inside moving along the stalls with the quiet attention of someone who understood animals. She didn't fuss over the horses, didn't talk to them the way people who weren't comfortable around them sometimes did. She moved at their pace, let them smell her hand, moved on. He watched her for a moment without speaking. She said without turning, "Your third stall has a horse favoring his right foreleg." He stopped. "I know." "When did it start?" 2 days ago. It's the tendon, I think, not the hoof." "May I look at it?" He said, "Go ahead." She went into the stall and crouched down and ran her hands along the leg in a way that was practiced and sure, not tentative. The horse, a bay gelding, who was generally suspicious of strangers, stood for it. She said, "Soft tissue. You're right about the tendon. It's not torn, just strained." She looked up. "Cold compress twice a day and keep him off hard ground for a week." He said, "You know horses." "My father ran a livery in Ohio for 20 years. She stood and stepped back out of the stall and looked at the gelding. "I grew up knowing horses before I knew much else." He said, "Ohio to Chicago to here." She said, "Life moves in directions you don't always choose." He picked up his feed buckets. "That's true." They worked the morning without talking much, and that was the second thing he noticed about her. She didn't treat silence as something that needed to be fixed. She filled the gaps with work instead of words, and the work she did was real. Not decorative, not the work of someone performing competence to make an impression. Just the work of a person who knew what needed doing and did it. By the time he came in at noon, something had shifted in the ranch that he couldn't name. A quality of the air, maybe. Something about the way a space feels when there is another person in it who is fully present. He didn't know what to do with that feeling. He put the kettle on and tried not to think about it. She found the photograph that evening. He hadn't hidden it. He'd just stopped looking at it so long ago that he'd forgotten it was in plain view on the shelf by the window. A small framed portrait, the kind a photographer in Clearwater had taken 15 years back, because Jonas had insisted and paid for it himself. She was standing by the window when he came in from the last evening check, and she had the photograph in her hands, and she was looking at it with an expression he couldn't quite read. She said, "This is you." "Yes." And the woman? He crossed to the stove without answering. She didn't press it. A moment later, she set the photograph down exactly where it had been, and he was grateful for that, for the precision of it, the respectfulness. She said quietly, "I'm sorry." He said, "For what?" "For whatever happened." He turned around. She was looking at him, not with pity, which he would have hated, and not with the particular soft-eyed sadness people deployed when they were performing sympathy. She was looking at him the way she'd looked at the horse's tendon, direct and real, and willing to see what was actually there. He said, "Her name was Ellie." He hadn't said that out loud in years. It dropped into the quiet of the room and just sat there. Clara said nothing. She didn't rush to fill it. She just let the name be present, which was more than most people had ever managed. He said, "She died 18 years ago. The baby too." A long pause. The fire settled. She said, "I'm sorry, Caleb." "So was I." He turned back to the stove and put his hands flat on either side of the warm iron and breathed. Behind him, he heard her move, not toward him, not away, just a small shift. The sound of a person staying present in a room where something difficult has been said. And that was enough. More than enough. More than anyone had offered him in a very long time. He rode for Clearwater the next morning before she was awake, and he rode with Jonas Miller's name sitting hot and low in his chest like a coal that hadn't quite caught. He had known Jonas for 31 years. He had trusted him the way you trust someone who was present at the worst moment of your life and stayed anyway. That kind of trust didn't break easy. But it bent. He was going to find out if it had broken. The ride to Clearwater took better than an hour, and he spent most of it running the letter back through his mind, the language of it, the details. Whoever had written it had known the ridge acreage, had known the type of cattle he ran, had known the altitude, the isolation, the specific language of a man who worked with his hands and didn't dress things up. There was only one person who knew all of that. He pulled up in front of Jonas's feed store at 9:30 and sat in the saddle for a moment before he dismounted. He thought about Clara Whitfield standing in his kitchen that morning, with her sleeves rolled up and her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, looking out the window at the ridge like she was trying to decide what she thought of it. He thought about the way she'd said Caleb when he'd offered her his name quiet, and considered like she was weighing it. He thought about the photograph on the shelf and the fact that she'd set it back exactly where it had been. He got down from the horse. He went inside. Jonas was behind the counter, and he looked up when Caleb came through the door, and what happened in his face in that moment was something Caleb would not forget for a long time. It wasn't surprise. It was something closer to the expression of a man who has been waiting for a consequence to arrive and is almost relieved that the waiting is over. Jonas said, "Caleb." Caleb put the letter on the counter between them. He said, "I need you to explain this to me." Jonas looked at the letter. He did not reach for it. He said, "Let me close up the store first." And that the way he said it, the way he didn't deny a single thing, told Caleb everything he needed to know before Jonas said another word. The letter was real. Jonas had done it. And somewhere back on Mercer Ridge, a woman who had traveled 11 days on a lie was feeding his horses and asking no one for anything. Caleb pulled out a chair from the table Jonas used for his ledgers, sat down in it, and waited. Jonas Miller closed the front door of the feed store, turned the sign to "Closed," and pulled the curtain across the window. He did all of it slowly, the way a man moves when he is buying himself time he knows he doesn't deserve. Caleb watched him do it without speaking. Jonas came back to the table and sat down across from him, and for a long moment neither of them said anything. The letter was still between them on the table. Jonas hadn't touched it. He looked at it the way a man looks at a thing he made with his own hands that he is no longer proud of. He said, "How long has she been out there?" Caleb said, 2 days. And she stayed. The storm kept her. Jonas nodded slowly. And now she's waiting for the truth. Caleb leaned forward. Same as me. Jonas put his hands on the table, both of them flat, and opened the gesture of a man surrendering before he's even asked a question. He said, "I wrote it in February. Took me 3 drafts before I got the language right. Had to sound like you." A pause. "That was the hardest part." "The hardest part," Caleb repeated. "Getting the voice right. You don't use many words, but the ones you use are specific. I had to think hard about Jonas." The name came out low and flat, and it stopped the older man cold. Why? Not a question. A demand with no room in it. Jonas looked at his hands. "I rode out to the ridge in January. You remember that?" Caleb remembered. Jonas had brought venison and a bottle of rye he never opened. They'd sat by the stove for 2 hours, and Caleb had said maybe 40 words total. "I rode home that night," Jonas said, "and I told my wife that you were going to die out there. Not from the cold. Not from an accident." He looked up. "From being gone already. Inside." Caleb said nothing. Margaret cried. "You know she doesn't cry easy." Jonas's jaw tightened. "She said, then do something. And I told her there was nothing to do. A man's got the right to live however he chooses, even if he's choosing to disappear." He paused. "But I kept thinking about it. Thinking about Ellie, about what she would have wanted for you." "Don't. Caleb. Don't put this on Ellie." His voice was very quiet. That quiet that had nothing soft in it. "She is not a reason you get to use." Jonas absorbed that. He didn't flinch from it, which was the only thing that kept Caleb from standing up and walking out. "You're right," Jonas said. "That was wrong of me. I'll take that back." He folded his hands together. "The truth is simpler and uglier. I couldn't watch you disappear for another year. I'd already watched you disappear for 18 of them, and I ran out of patience with doing nothing." Caleb said, "So you found a woman in Chicago and sent her to my door on a lie. I wrote to the agency under your name, paid the correspondence fee from my own pocket. I described the ranch honest, the work, the altitude, the isolation, all of it. I didn't make it sound like a pleasure post. I wanted a woman who knew what hard living looked like and wasn't afraid of it. And Clara Whitfield, I didn't choose her specifically. The agency matched her to the letter." Jonas met his eyes. But when they wrote back with her profile, what she'd done, where she'd come from, what she said she was looking for, I thought, "You thought." I thought she had the kind of backbone that wouldn't break against yours." The words landed in the silence and stayed there. Caleb stood up. He didn't do it fast, didn't knock the chair back. He just stood slowly with the particular control of a man who is keeping something very large and very dangerous from moving. He said, "She sold everything she had, Jonas. She sold her position. She traveled 11 days. She stood in my yard in the rain holding a letter that was supposed to tell her she had a home, and I had to look her in the face and tell her I had no idea who she was." Jonas closed his eyes. "She didn't cry," Caleb said. "She didn't fall apart. She stood there and she took it because she is that kind of person. And you put her in that position. You did that." "I know." "I don't think you do." He picked up the letter from the table. "I don't think you let yourself know it, because if you had, you couldn't have sent it." Jonas didn't answer. There was nothing to answer with. Caleb folded the letter and put it in his coat pocket. He said, "She wants to be there when you explain yourself. You're going to ride out to the ridge with me." Jonas looked up. "Today. Today." They rode mostly in silence, which was not unusual between them, but the texture of this silence was different from anything they'd carried before. It had weight and edge. Caleb kept his horse a half-length ahead the whole way, which was not something he'd ever done with Jonas in 31 years, and Jonas didn't try to close the distance. They came up the road to the ranch just past noon, and Clara was on the roof. Caleb pulled up short. She was up there with a hammer and a handful of iron nails working at a section of the roof over the east side of the cabin, where 2 boards had split last winter, and he'd patched them badly, and meant to fix it properly ever since. She had her coat off despite the cold, working in her heavy blouse, with her sleeves still rolled, and she was driving nails with the clean, practiced efficiency of someone who had done it before. Jonas said behind him very quietly, "Good Lord." Caleb didn't say anything. He got down from his horse and watched her work for a moment. She hadn't heard them come up. The hammer was too loud. He said her name. She looked down. Saw Jonas. Something shifted in her face. Not dramatic, not obvious, just a particular sharpening of attention. She drove one more nail. Then she came down the ladder with the hammer in her hand, and she stood in the yard and looked at Jonas Miller with the kind of stillness that is more unsettling than anger. She said, "You're Jonas." Jonas had gotten down from his horse. He was a big man 60s with a lined face and the hands of someone who'd worked hard his whole life. He looked at Clara Whitfield, and what crossed his expression was something Caleb had never seen on his face before. Shame. Genuine, uncomplicated shame. He said, "I am. And you're Miss Whitfield." "Clara." She held the hammer at her side. "Did you write the letter?" "Yes." "Did you sign Caleb's name to it?" "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" And Jonas told her. All of it the same as he'd told Caleb, but this time directed at her, which was harder. He didn't soften it. He didn't reach for justification more than once, and when he did, when he started a sentence with, "I only meant to," Clara made a small, precise gesture with her free hand, and he stopped. She said, "What you meant doesn't change what happened." "No," he said. "It doesn't. I left a job. I left the city where I knew people. I left the last connection I had to a life I had built from nothing." Her voice was even. Dangerously even. "I did all of that because I received a letter from a man who I believed had been honest with me about who he was and what he needed. And that letter was a lie." Jonas said, "Yes, so I want to be very precise with you, Mr. Miller." She took one step forward. "Was I a tool? Did you use me the way you'd use a fence post? Drive me in somewhere because you needed something to hold a line?" The question hung in the air between them. Jonas said, "That's not how I thought of it." "How did you think of it?" A long pause. "I thought of it as a chance, for both of you." "You didn't give me a chance," she said. "You made a decision for me and dressed it up as an opportunity. There's a difference." She let that land. A significant one. Caleb was watching her, and something was happening in his chest that he didn't have easy language for. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't crying. She was standing in the cold yard with a hammer in her hand, delivering the most precise accounting of a wrong he had ever heard. And she was doing it for herself, not to perform hurt, not to extract apology, but because she needed it to be said out loud by someone who was looking directly at the man who'd done it. Jonas said, "You're right. On all of it, I made a choice that wasn't mine to make." "Yes, you did. And I'm sorry, Miss Whitfield, genuinely. Whatever that's worth." She considered him for a moment longer. Then she said, "It's worth something. Not everything, but something." She turned and walked back toward the cabin door. At the threshold, she stopped without turning around. "I'll put coffee on. You can come in if you want." She went inside. Jonas and Caleb stood in the yard. Jonas said very quietly, "She's remarkable." Caleb said, "She is." "Caleb, don't." He started toward the cabin. "Come inside. Drink the coffee she made, and then go home to Margaret and tell her what you did." Jonas followed him without another word. The three of them sat around the table, and it was one of the stranger hours Caleb had spent in recent memory, which was saying something given recent memory. Jonas drank his coffee and answered the questions Clara put to him, and she put them carefully, one at a time, like a person working through a problem they intend to fully understand. She asked how he'd found the agency. He told her a notice in a Chicago paper that had come through the Clearwater post office addressed to someone else left unclaimed for a month. She asked what he'd said about her, what the agency had told him when they responded. He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper, the agency's reply letter, and set it on the table in front of her. She read it without expression. Then she set it down and put her hands in her lap and was quiet for a moment. She said, "They described me as capable, adaptable, and unencumbered by sentiment." A pause. "I'm not sure whether to be flattered or insulted." Jonas said, "I thought it sounded like someone worth knowing." She looked at him. "Did you?" "The encumbered by sentiment part is a compliment in my experience. The women who aren't tend to be the ones who get things done." Something flickered across her face. Not quite a smile, the shape of one. She said, "You are a manipulative old man, Mr. Miller." "Yes, ma'am, I am." "And you did a wrong thing." "Yes, ma'am, I did. But I am not going to pretend," she said carefully, "that I understand nothing of what drove you to do it." She glanced at Caleb, brief, precise, and then back to Jonas. "That doesn't excuse it. I want to be clear. But I am not a woman who ignores the whole of a thing in order to condemn a part of it." Jonas looked at her with something that might have been relief, if relief could be mixed equally with guilt. He finished his coffee. He stood up. He said to Caleb, "I'll do whatever you need me to do to make this right. If there are costs she's owed." "We'll talk about that," Caleb said. "I mean it." "I know you do." He walked Jonas to the door. "Go home." Jonas went. Caleb stood in the doorway and watched him ride down the road until the sound of the hooves faded. Behind him, Clara said, "You're angrier at him than you're showing." He turned. She was still at the table watching him. He said, "Yes." "Why aren't you showing it?" "Because it won't help anything." "Sometimes anger helps. Not this kind." He came back to the table and sat down. "This kind just burns the house down." She looked at him for a long moment. "You've had practice at it." "At burning houses down. At managing the kind of anger that wants to." He said, 18 years of practice." She nodded once slowly. "What are you going to do about him?" "Nothing right now. He's been my friend for 30 years. That doesn't vanish over one—" He stopped. "Over what he did?" "No," she said. "It doesn't vanish, but it changes shape." He hadn't thought of it that way. He thought of it that way now. He said, "What do you want to do about your situation?" She was quiet. Outside, the wind moved across the ridge. Not the storm wind, just the ordinary cold wind that lived up here most of the year, the kind that Caleb had stopped hearing a long time ago. She said, "I want to think about it." "That's fair." "I don't want to make a decision based on the immediate feeling of it. I've done that before. It doesn't work well." He said, "You can stay as long as you need." She looked at him. "You keep saying that." "Because I keep meaning it." A pause. "Caleb?" She said his name the same way she had that first morning weighted measured. "I am not going to be a burden to you." "You're not." "I'm also not going to be a pity case. I didn't come here to be rescued." "I know." "Then what am I doing here?" He said honestly, "I don't know yet, but I don't think the answer is nothing." She looked at him for a long time, with those careful dark eyes that had started the trip tired and were now something else still tired, but sharpening toward something. She said, "That may be the second most honest thing you've said to me." He said, "What was the first?" She almost smiled. "When you said you didn't know how to be hospitable." He said, "That's still true. I noticed." She stood and started to clear the cups from the table, moving around the kitchen with the same easy economy she brought to everything. "But you made the coffee, both mornings, without being asked." He didn't say anything. She said, not looking at him, "That counts for something." She stayed. Not because the storm came back and not because he asked her to. She stayed because she made the decision to stay, and she told him so directly the evening of the second day after Jonas's visit. She said, "I've decided not to leave yet. I want you to know that's my choice. I'm not waiting on permission, and I'm not waiting on circumstances." He said, All right. All right, she repeated as if testing the word. Is that it? What else do you want me to say? I don't know. Most people say more than they mean. I try to only say what I mean. She looked at him. I know. I've noticed. A pause. It's unusual. Is it a problem? No, she said slowly. No, it's not a problem at all. She took the barn that week, not because he assigned it to her, he hadn't, but because she looked at what needed doing and did it. She reorganized the tack, cleaned the stall drainage properly, which he had done wrong for years without knowing it. She put the gelding on the cold compress schedule she'd prescribed and didn't ask him to check her work. He checked it anyway privately, and it was right. He started finding things done that he hadn't asked anyone to do and hadn't expected to find done. The broken bridle from the kitchen table was repaired and hung in the barn. The winter stock records, which he'd left in disarray since November, were organized into a ledger with her handwriting neat and direct, no flourish, noting what he'd missed. He stood in the barn with the ledger in his hands and didn't know what to do with what he was feeling. He said when he found her at the evening feed, "You didn't have to do the records." She said, "They were wrong. It would have cost you in spring." "I know they were wrong. I meant—" He stopped. "Thank you." She looked at him over the back of the bay mare. "You're welcome." He stood there a moment longer than was necessary. She said, "Was there something else?" He said no, and went inside and stood in the kitchen with his hands on the stove and thought about a word he hadn't said in a very long time, "thank you," and how it had come out of his mouth just now with none of the awkwardness he'd expected. Just the word. Clean and real. He put water on for supper and tried to remember what Ellie had looked like at the stove. He could still see it, the shape of her, the way she'd hummed sometimes without knowing she was doing it. The memory was there, same as always. What was different was that it wasn't the only thing in the room. On the fifth night, the temperature dropped hard. He was up at 2 in the morning because the cattle were moving wrong. He could hear it through the wall, and he pulled on his boots and coat without lighting a lamp. He was halfway to the barn when he realized the light was already on inside it. She was there. Had been there by the look of it for the better part of an hour. She'd found the heifer that was in early distress, the youngest one in the herd, and she was crouched in the stall with her hands steady and her voice low, keeping the animal calm. He crouched down beside her without a word. She said without looking at him, "She started about an hour ago. I heard her from the house." "You heard her?" "I sleep light." He looked at the heifer. The situation was manageable but needed watching. He said, "You should have come and woken me. I had it." "I know you had it." He looked at her profile in the lantern light, the focused set of her mouth, the way her hands moved without hesitation. "That's not what I meant." She glanced at him, just briefly. "What did you mean?" He said, "You don't have to do everything alone." Something changed in her face. Very small. Like a muscle that had been held tight for a very long time, just released slightly. She turned back to the heifer and didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "That's a complicated thing to hear." "I know." "You don't know the half of it," she said quietly. "But all right." They stayed in the barn until nearly 4, and the heifer came through it fine, and neither of them spoke much, and the silence between them was the most different it had been yet. Not hostile, not cautious, just shared. When they came back inside, she made the coffee because it was nearly morning anyway, and they sat at the table in the pre-dawn quiet, and he looked at the woman across from him. This woman who had arrived on a lie and stayed on her own terms and fixed his ledger and his roof and his sick horse without asking a single thing in return, and thought about what Jonas had said. "I thought she had the kind of backbone that wouldn't break against yours." He hadn't wanted to give Jonas any part of being right. He was beginning to think Jonas might be right anyway. She was looking at her coffee. She said, "I got a letter today. Before you ask, from the stage driver, not the agency." He passed it along. She reached into her blouse pocket and set a folded envelope on the table. "From a woman I knew in Chicago. She's heard there's some trouble with the agency. Complaints from women who paid into the correspondence system and didn't receive what was promised. He looked at the letter. What kind of trouble? She didn't say specifically. Clara looked up at him. But she said I should be careful, and she said I should write back with my current address. A pause. He said, What address did you give? She met his eyes, quiet, level. She said, I haven't answered yet. He looked at her across the table in the gray pre-dawn light, and the coffee steamed between them, and outside the ridge wind ran cold along the east wall of the cabin, and neither of them said the thing that was sitting right there in the middle of the room. But it was there. It had been there if he was honest with himself since the morning she'd set the photograph back in exactly the right place on the shelf. He said, When you're ready to answer it, let me know. She said, Why? He said, Because whatever address you give, you should think carefully about it. She held his gaze for a long moment. I know, she said softly, and drank her coffee. Clara answered the letter from Chicago on a Tuesday. She didn't tell Caleb she was doing it until it was already written, folded, and sealed. She set it on the table in front of him at breakfast and said, I'm sending this with the stage driver today. I wanted you to see it before I did. He looked at the envelope. His address was on it, the Ranch, Mercer Ridge, Utah Territory, written in her clean, unadorned hand. He said, You used this address. I did. He looked up at her. She said, I'm not declaring anything by it. I needed an address to put down, and this is where I am. A pause. But I wanted you to see it, because you told me to think carefully about it, and I did. He picked up his coffee. What does the letter say? That I arrived safely, that I'm at a working ranch, that the situation was not what it appeared to be when I left Chicago, but that I am not in danger. She sat down across from him. And that if there is trouble with the agency, she should write me here because I intend to know about it. He set the cup down. What kind of trouble are you expecting? I don't know yet, but my friend Ellen doesn't use the word trouble lightly. She said women who paid into the correspondence system didn't receive what was promised. Clara folded her hands on the table. I was one of those women. I paid a registration fee and a correspondence fee. The agency kept both. How much? She told him. It was not a small amount. Not for a woman working a boarding position in Chicago. He said nothing for a moment. Then, I'll cover it. You will not. Clara. Caleb. Her voice was firm and level. We have had this conversation. I am not a debt you owe. It's not about debt. Then what is it about? He said. It's about the fact that the money is gone because of something that started with my name. My name on a letter I didn't write to an agency that apparently took money from women and didn't deliver what they promised. He held her gaze. That's connected enough that I'm not going to sit across from you and pretend otherwise. She was quiet for a moment. He could see her working through it, the part of her that refused charity, battling the part that was honest enough to recognize a reasonable argument when it was made. She said, I'll let you cover the agency fees, nothing else. Fair. And I want it noted that I find this entire arrangement uncomfortable. Noted? She picked up the envelope and stood. I'm riding to Clearwater to post it myself. I won't ask you to do it. I'll ride with you. She stopped. That's not necessary. I know. He stood up. I'll saddle the horses. She looked at him for a moment, with an expression he was beginning to know, the one where she was recalibrating something, adjusting to a version of him that kept being slightly different from the version she'd prepared for. She said, All right. They rode into Clearwater side by side, and it was the first time Caleb had ridden that road with another person in longer than he could precisely remember. The town registered their arrival the way small towns register everything, with looks that were just slightly too long and conversations that paused just slightly too obviously. He saw it. He was certain she saw it too, because she saw most things. At the post office, while she was at the counter with her letter, he heard Mrs. Aldrich, who ran the dry goods next door and served as Clearwater's primary transmission system for all information, say to no one in particular, quite loudly. "Is that Caleb Mercer with a woman?" Clara at the counter did not react. He did not react. But when they came back out to the horses, she said without looking at him, "How long has it been since you came to town with anyone?" He said, "Long time. They'll talk." "They will. Does that bother you?" He thought about it honestly. "No." She looked at him. "No? They've had nothing to say about me for 18 years. Let them talk." He untied his horse. "Does it bother you?" A small pause. "I've had people talk about me before. I survived it." What did they talk about? She mounted her horse with the ease of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. A woman who doesn't marry when she's supposed to and doesn't explain herself to anyone tends to generate commentary. She settled in the saddle. "I stopped listening to it a long time ago." He said, "How long?" "About 10 years. She looked down the road. "I was 16 when people started telling me who I should be. I gave it a fair trial. It didn't suit me." He said, "What happened when you were 16? She was quiet for a moment. Long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then she said, "My father's livery failed. We lost everything, the business, the house, all of it. My mother wanted me to marry a man in town who had money and could support the family. He was 43 years old, and he looked at me the way a man looks at a property he's considering purchasing." Caleb said nothing. "I said no," Clara continued. "My mother didn't speak to me properly for 2 years. The man told people in town that I had ideas above my station." She looked at him. "He wasn't wrong. I did have ideas above my station. That's what I was carrying when I got on the train to Chicago at 18 with $11 and a traveling bag." He said, "The same bag you came here with." "The same bag." A pause. "It's been a useful bag." They rode for a while without talking. The road ran flat between them and the ridge, and the sky was the particular clear cold blue that came after a hard storm had scrubbed everything clean. He said, "You were right about Jonas." She glanced at him. "Which part?" "When you said you understood something of what drove him." He kept his eyes on the road. "I didn't want to give him that, but it's true." "You were disappearing," she said quietly. "Not as an accusation, just as a fact." He said, "Yes." "Had you noticed?" Long pause. "I'd noticed I didn't much care, which I think amounts to the same thing." She rode beside him and didn't say anything immediately. When she spoke, her voice was careful. "My father did that. After the livery. He was there physically. He came to meals. He slept in his bed. But the part of him that had been present, that had been interested in things, it was gone." She paused. "He never came back from it." "Not really." Caleb said, "I'm sorry." "He lived another 12 years. 12 years of being elsewhere." She said it the way someone says a thing they've thought about many times without ever quite resolving. "I used to wonder what it would have taken, what could have gotten through." He said, "You think Jonas thought about that? I think Jonas watched you disappearing and did the only dramatic thing he could think of." She looked at him. "I still think it was wrong. I'll go on thinking it was wrong. But I understand the desperation underneath it." He said, "So do I." "Does that change anything between you and him?" He thought about it honestly. "Not yet. Maybe eventually." A pause. "Jonas doesn't do things for bad reasons. That's the hardest part. If he were a bad man, it would be simpler." She said, "The worst wrongs are always done by people who think they're doing right." "Yes. It doesn't make the wrong smaller." "No," he said. "It doesn't." They came up the long rise toward the ridge, and he looked at the shape of the land the way he always did, coming home the particular fold of the terrain, the way the ridge caught the light in late afternoon. He had looked at it 10,000 times, and it had never meant anything beyond the next day's work. Right now, coming up the road with another person riding beside him, it looked different. He couldn't have said precisely how. The second letter from Chicago arrived 10 days later. This one wasn't from Ellen. The handwriting on the outside was different, thicker, more formal, and the return address was a law office on State Street. Clara stood at the table and opened it carefully, and Caleb stood near the stove and watched her face as she read. She read it once, then she sat down. He said, "What is it?" She set the letter on the table. She put both hands flat on either side of it, and for a moment she just looked at it, and he could see something working in her face that she was keeping very controlled. She said, "The Fairfield Domestic Agency in Chicago is under investigation for financial fraud." He came to the table, sat down across from her. They collected registration and correspondence fees from over 60 women across 4 states. Her voice was steady, careful. The fees were substantial in most cases. The agency represented itself as having a large pool of legitimate correspondence partners, ranchers, merchants, landowners seeking wives. She paused. Most of those partners did not exist. The kitchen was very quiet. Caleb said, "The letter Jonas sent made me a legitimate placement, one of the few real ones." She looked up at him. "Which means the agency used my placement to prove they were a functioning service. They showed my file to other women as evidence. My case was one of the ones they pointed to." Something tightened in her jaw. "I was their proof of concept." He said, "What does the law office want?" "They want a sworn statement. They're building a civil case on behalf of the women who paid fees for services that were fraudulent." She straightened the letter on the table. "They need to know what I received, what I paid, what happened when I arrived." A pause. "And they want me to testify to the fact that I was matched to a real person, which distinguishes my case from the others." "Meaning your testimony helps their case?" "Yes." "And puts you in the middle of it?" "Yes." She looked at him. "In Salt Lake City. In front of a federal hearing officer, probably within 2 months." He said, "Will you go?" She said without hesitation, "Yes." "Even knowing you'll be the face of the legitimate case, the one they hold up as real while the others were fake, especially knowing that." Her voice had an edge to it now, not anger exactly, but the heat of something deeply decided. "Those women lost money they couldn't afford to lose. Some of them made the same choices I did, left jobs, moved, sold things. On the strength of a lie that institution told them." She picked up the letter. "If my testimony helps them recover what they're owed, I will travel to Salt Lake City and say every word of it." He looked at her. She looked back at him. He said, "I'll go with you." She blinked, just once. "You don't have to do that." "I know." "Caleb, Salt Lake City is 3 days' travel. You'd be gone from the ranch nearly 2 weeks. I know what Salt Lake City is. The cattle. Hector Reyes owes me 12 days of help from last spring. I'll call it in." He held her gaze. "You shouldn't travel that road alone, and you shouldn't walk into a federal proceeding without a character witness if one is available." She said very quietly, "You would do that." "I'm telling you I will." Something moved through her face. Not quite what he expected. Not relief or gratitude, something more complicated, something that looked almost like it cost her something to receive. She said, "You barely know me." He said, "I know enough." She looked down at the letter. Her hands flat on the table were very still. She said, "People don't usually—" She stopped. He waited. "People don't usually do things like that," she said finally, "without wanting something in return." He said, "I don't want anything in return." "I know." She looked up. "That's what I mean." He said Clara. He said her name the way she'd taught him to, like it mattered, like it was worth the air it took. "Whatever brought you here, the lie Jonas told the storm, all of it, you have worked this ranch for 10 days without being asked. Fixed things I'd left broken for years, and sat up at 2 in the morning with a sick heifer like it was your own animal." He paused. "You think I don't notice that?" She said nothing. "I notice it," he said. "Every day." She was looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen on her before. Not the careful steadiness. Something underneath that, something more unguarded and more real. She said, "You are not at all what I expected." He said, "What did you expect?" The letter described a lonely rancher. A small pause. "I expected lonely." "I was." "I know, but lonely doesn't mean—" She searched for the word. "Empty." He said, "I was getting there." "Maybe?" She folded the letter slowly. "But there's still something here." "There was always something here. I could tell on the first day." He said, "What told you?" She said, "The photograph. You kept it where you'd see it every day. A man who was truly gone inside would have put it away." She looked at him. "You kept it out. That means some part of you still believed you deserved to remember." The kitchen was so quiet. He could hear the fire breathe. He said, "That's a significant thing to read from a photograph." "I read people quickly. It's a survival skill." A pause. "I had to learn it early." He said, "When you were 16. Before that even." She stood and went to put the kettle on, moving around his kitchen, with the ease of someone who has been somewhere long enough to know where things are kept. "My father was a good man when things went well. When things went badly, he became someone else. I learned to read the difference fast." He said, "Were you afraid of him?" "Sometimes." She said it plainly, without drama. "Not often. Mostly I was just alert, watching for which version of him I was dealing with." She turned to face him. "It made me good at reading rooms. And people." He said, "What do you read in this room?" She looked at him for a long, steady moment. She said, "A man who is more present than he was 2 weeks ago." He said, "Is that good?" She said, "Yes, Caleb. That's very good." That night, he lay awake for a long time. He was not given to introspection, had trained himself out of it years ago, because introspection in an empty house at 2 in the morning was a specific kind of torture he'd learned to avoid. He thought about work instead. What needed doing? What was broken? What would cost him in spring if he didn't address it now? But tonight his mind kept returning to the table, to her hands flat on either side of that letter, to the way she'd said people don't usually do things like that without wanting something in return, and the way it had sounded not suspicious, not defensive, but genuinely surprised. Like someone encountering a thing they'd read about but never actually seen up close. He thought about being 16 years old and watching your father become someone else and learning to read the difference fast. He thought about $11 and a traveling bag and Chicago at 18. He thought about 10 years of people talking and her saying, "I stopped listening to it a long time ago," the same way you say a thing that hurt you once but has become simply the way things are. She had survived a very long time on her own by being excellent at everything she did and never needing anyone to do it with her. He understood that more than he could say. He had been doing the same thing for 18 years, just in a different direction. She had run toward things, built things, moved toward noise and life. He had run away from all of it and called it surviving. He thought about what she'd said. "You kept the photograph out. That means some part of you still believed you deserved to remember." He had not thought of it that way. He had thought of keeping the photograph as a kind of punishment, a reminder of what he'd lost and why he had no right to want anything else. He had looked at it in the mornings, sometimes, not every morning, but sometimes, and felt the weight of it, and then gone out to feed the cattle, because the cattle didn't require him to feel anything at all. He had not thought of it as believing he deserved to remember. He lay in the dark and thought about that, reframing the way you hold an object and turn it in your hand, and suddenly the light hits it differently, and it is not what you thought it was. He was still awake at midnight when he heard her moving in the spare room. Not loudly, she was quiet even in sleep, quiet in the way of someone accustomed to not taking up too much space. But he heard the particular sound of someone turning, and then stillness again, and then after a long pause a sound that stopped him cold. She was crying, not loudly, not with the full-throated abandon of someone letting it out. Quietly, precisely the way she did everything, controlled even in this, as if she had learned that grief, like anger, needed to be managed carefully, or it would cost you something you couldn't afford. He lay very still and did not move because he understood instinctively that going to the door would be the wrong thing. She had not chosen to show him this. She was not showing it to anyone. She was doing it alone in the dark, this thing she hadn't let herself do in the days of confronting Jonas, and reading legal letters, and making decisions about testimony, and federal hearings, and Salt Lake City. She had held all of it steady through all of that, and now in the dark alone, she was setting it down for just a little while. He lay still and let her. After a while the sound stopped. A long stretch of silence. Then the quiet particular stillness of sleep. He looked at the ceiling in the dark for another hour. He thought she held it together every minute I could see her. He thought I know that specific kind of exhausted. He thought I should have known she was carrying more than she was showing. He thought I should have asked. He hadn't asked. He'd been so careful about not pressing about giving her the space he himself had always needed that he'd mistaken her steadiness for the absence of weight. She wasn't weightless. She was just extremely good at carrying. He made a decision in the dark without dramatics. He made it the way he made most decisions, quietly, practically, with the clear-eyed recognition that something needed doing, and he was the one in a position to do it. He was going to make it easier for her to put some of it down. He didn't know exactly what that looked like. He had 18 years of rust on the machinery of caring for another person. But he knew the first step in the morning he was going to ask how she was. Not how the horses were, not what she'd found wrong with the fence line, not whether she'd heard back from Ellen in Chicago. How she was. And he was going to mean it. She was at the stove when he came out in the morning, same as every morning. She had the coffee ready, and her sleeves rolled, and her hair done in the practical knot, and she turned when she heard him and said, "Good morning," the way she always did, clean and direct and fully composed. He said, "Good morning." He sat down. He looked at her. She set the coffee in front of him and started to turn back to the stove. He said, "Clara." She turned. Something's in his voice had registered something different from the usual morning. He said, "How are you?" Not the routine greeting. The real question. And she could hear the difference because she read people fast, and she read him faster than most. He saw her face change just slightly, just at the edges. And then she held very still for a moment, the way a person holds still when they are deciding whether to let something in. She said, "I'm all right." He said, "I know you were up last night." A pause. Brief. She said, "I'm sorry if I woke you." "You didn't." He held her gaze. "I was already awake." He let a moment pass. "You don't have to be all right, Clara. Not in here." Her hands, she was holding a dish towel, tightened slightly and then released. She said, "I have been managing difficult situations for a long time. It's a hard habit to set down." "I know," he said. "So have I." She looked at him. He looked back. Outside, the ridge wind ran across the east wall, same as it always did, same as it had for 18 years of him being the only person inside this cabin to hear it. She sat down across from him. She said, "I thought I knew what I was walking into when I got on that train. I thought I had prepared for every version of how this might go." A pause. "I hadn't prepared for any of the versions that actually happened." He said, "Which version bothers you most?" She thought about it. "The one where I realize I'm not sure what I am here." Her voice was honest and quiet. "Not a wife, not a guest, not exactly an employee, not a charity case. I won't be that." She looked at her coffee. "I've been very good at knowing my position in a room. It's how I've stayed safe. And right now, I don't know my position." He said, "Does it have to be a fixed position?" She looked up. He said, "You don't have to be a category, Clara. You're a person who is here. That's enough for right now." She was very quiet. He said, "Unless the uncertainty is costing you too much. If it is, tell me. We'll figure out what's practical." She said, "It's not the uncertainty." A pause. "It's that I'm afraid of what I want." He didn't push. He didn't ask. He just waited because she had earned the right to say it in her own time, or not at all. She said very quietly, "I want to stay." Not as an announcement, not as a request. Just the truth of it said out loud, finally, in a voice that was steadier than it had any right to be given what it was costing her to say. He looked at her across the table. He said, "Then stay." She said, "Just like that." Just like that. She made a small sound. Not a laugh. Not quite. But something that was the shape of one, and something in it broke a little, and she looked down at the table for a moment with her jaw tight, holding the rest of it in. He let her. After a moment she looked up. Her eyes were dry, but something in them was different, clearer. Like weather that has changed but not passed. She said, "There is still the matter of Chicago." "There is. And the hearing in Salt Lake City." "We'll go. And the money from the agency." "Clara." He said it firmly, not harshly, just the voice of a man who is done negotiating certain things. "We will handle all of it, one piece at a time." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "You keep saying we." He said, "I keep meaning it." Outside the ridge caught the early light, the way it did every morning, same as it always had. But inside the cabin, something had settled quiet and real into the spaces that had been empty for a very long time. She picked up her coffee. He picked up his. And the morning came in around them the way mornings do when something has finally been said that needed saying. And the house, for the first time in 18 years, felt like a place where two people lived. The third letter from Chicago arrived on a Friday, and this one was not from Ellen. Clara was in the barn when the stage driver passed it to Caleb at the gate, and Caleb stood in the yard and read the outside of the envelope and felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the temperature. The return address was the same State Street law office, but there was a second name below the firm's, a name he didn't recognize. Special Investigator, U.S. Marshal's Office, Northern District of Illinois. He waited until she came in for the midday meal before he set it on the table. She saw his face first, then the envelope. She said, "That's not from the lawyers." "It's from the Marshal's office. Joint letter." She sat down and opened it without hesitation, and he watched her read it the way he'd watched her read the first one straight through, no visible reaction, processing everything before she let any of it show. This time, though, something shifted in her face halfway down the page. Something he hadn't seen before. She set the letter on the table. He said, "Tell me." She said, "The fraud is larger than the lawyers indicated in the first letter. Significantly larger." She pressed her fingertips flat against the page. The agency was operated by two men. One managed the correspondence end, the fake listings, the letters, the fee collection. The other was a solicitor who managed the funds once they came in. She looked up. They didn't just take registration fees. They offered some women an additional service, a guaranteed placement fund. Women paid into it on the promise that the fund would be held in trust and returned if no match was made within 1 year. He said, and it wasn't. It wasn't. The fund was dissolved into a private account in St. Louis within 2 months of the agency opening. She picked up the letter again. 63 women paid into it. Total amount taken roughly $19,000. The number landed hard in the quiet kitchen. He said, "Did you pay into the fund?" A pause. "Yes." He kept his face still. "How much?" She told him. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "Clara, I know." Her voice was controlled. "I know how much it was. I knew when I paid it that it was most of what I had. But the documentation looked genuine. I had a lawyer in Chicago look at it, a real lawyer, and he said the trust instrument was properly formed." She set the letter down. They were very good at what they did. He said, "The Marshal's office. What do they want from you? Full testimony. Not just the civil hearing, a criminal proceeding." She met his eyes. "They're charging the two men with wire fraud and theft by deception under federal statute. They need witnesses who can speak to specific representations the agency made." She paused. "My case is the one they want most because I actually arrived, because the placement they used to legitimize their operation was mine." He said, "They used you to make the whole thing look real." "Yes." The word came out flat and precise and very cold. Every fraudulent listing they showed to other women, they backed up with the documentation of my case. I was the proof that the agency worked. I was the reason 62 other women believed it was safe to pay. He stood up and walked to the stove. Not because he needed anything from it, because he needed to move, needed to put somewhere the particular anger that was building in his chest. Not the hot, wild kind. The cold, quiet kind that he had learned over 18 years was far more dangerous. He said, "When do they need you in Salt Lake City?" 6 weeks. Same hearing. The civil and criminal proceedings have been consolidated. 1 trip. She paused. "Caleb, there's something else." He turned. She said, "The marshal's investigator indicates in the letter that the man who managed the funds, the solicitor, has connections in Utah territory. He moved money through a bank in Ogden. They believe he may know I'm here." She held his gaze. "Not specifically here, but that I traveled west. The agency had my destination address from the correspondence they sent me before I left Chicago." He came back to the table, sat down, looked at the letter. He said Mercer Ridge. It was in the original correspondence the agency sent confirming the match. They had the address. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said very evenly, "How long have you known this was possible?" She said, "Since the second letter, when they mentioned Ogden." A pause. "I didn't want to alarm you without more information." "Clara, I know. That was not your decision to make alone." She looked at him. Something in her face was the same expression from the first night. The one he'd come to understand meant she was recognizing a version of him that contradicted her expectations. She said, "You're right. I'm sorry." It was the first time she'd apologized to him for anything, and the directness of it, the lack of qualification, landed with more weight than he'd expected. He said, "All right," and meant it. He looked at the letter again. "What does the investigator recommend?" "That I not travel alone. That I notify local law in Clearwater." She paused. "And that I consider that my presence at this address may draw attention before the hearing." He said, "Meaning they might come here. Meaning it's possible." He put the letter down. He looked at his hands on the table, the calloused, weathered hands of a man who had spent 18 years doing only the work that kept himself alive. He thought about what those hands had done in the last 3 weeks. Fixed the fence at the north pasture with her. Rebuilt the tack shelf in the barn while she reorganized the winter feed records. Passed her tools up a ladder while she finished the roof repair she'd started alone. He said, "I'm going to ride to Clearwater this afternoon and speak to the sheriff." She said, "I'll come with you." "I'd rather you stay." "Caleb." Her voice was quiet but absolute. "I am not staying behind while you handle my situation." He looked at her. She said, "I have been managing my own difficulties since I was 18 years old. I will not stop now because things have become more complicated." He said, "I know you've been managing them alone. I'm not asking you to stop managing them. I'm asking you to let me stand next to you while you do." The kitchen went very quiet. She said carefully, "There's a difference." "Yes, there is." She was still for a long moment. Then she said, "All right, we ride together." Jihad. Sheriff Tom Pratt had been in Clearwater for 11 years and had the particular manner of a man who had seen enough trouble to stop being surprised by it without quite becoming indifferent to it. He listened to Caleb lay out the situation without interrupting, then read the marshal's letter twice, then set it on his desk and looked at Clara. He said, "Miss Whitfield, how certain is the investigator that the solicitor knows your specific location?" Clara said, "Not certain, but they believe it's possible. And the man's name is Harlan Voss, according to the letter." Pratt looked at Caleb. "You know anyone in the territory by that name?" "No." "I'll wire the marshal's office in Salt Lake today." He folded the letter and passed it back to Clara. "In the meantime, you're out on Mercer Ridge, which is 3 miles off the main road and not easily found by someone who doesn't know the country." He looked at Caleb. "You armed out there?" Caleb said, "I have a rifle and a shotgun. Know how to use them?" Yes. Miss Whitfield, Clara said without changing her expression. My father ran a livery in Ohio. We had trouble with theft 3 times in 6 years. I can handle a rifle. Pratt looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating. Then he said, All right. I'll have one of my deputies ride out every few days to check the road. I'll send word if the marshal's office responds with anything specific. He stood. Try not to let yourselves get isolated. If anything looks wrong, don't manage it alone, ride for town. Clara said, Understood. Pratt shook Caleb's hand. Then he turned to Clara and shook hers, which she accepted without comment, and which Caleb noticed Pratt did without thinking about it, as if it was the obvious thing to do, the natural conclusion of a conversation with a person who had just demonstrated complete competence. Outside they mounted and started back up the road to the ridge. After a while, Clara said, You didn't tell him the whole of how I came to be here. Caleb said, It wasn't relevant to what he needed to know. She looked at him. You protected Jonas. I protected you from having to explain it to a man who didn't need to know. A pause. Jonas can explain himself to Tom Pratt if it becomes necessary. Today, it wasn't. She rode beside him in silence for a moment. She said, Thank you. He said, Don't thank me for doing the obvious thing. It isn't obvious to everyone. It should be. That evening, Jonas Miller rode out unannounced for the first time since the confrontation in the yard, and Caleb saw him coming up the road and stepped outside to meet him before he reached the cabin. Jonas pulled up. He looked at Caleb's face and said, I heard from Tom Pratt. He wired me after you left his office because he thought I might know the territory around Ogden better than you do. A pause. He told me what's in that letter. Caleb said, All right. Caleb, Jonas leaned forward on his horse. I need to say something and I need you to let me say it. Say it. What I did writing that letter, I thought the worst that could happen was she'd arrive. You'd explain the mistake, and she'd go home with enough money for the fare. He held Caleb's gaze. I did not foresee that my letter would become the instrument these men used to legitimize their fraud. I did not know the agency was corrupt. I did not know any woman would lose money. His voice dropped. I did not know Clara Whitfield would lose everything she had. Caleb said, No, you didn't know. But she did, because of something I set in motion. Yes. Jonas was quiet for a moment. Is she all right? She's Clara. She's functioning at full capacity while carrying more than most people could stand. He paused. She's not all right. But she's not broken. What can I do? Caleb thought about it. Not the angry, reflexive answer, the real one. You know the territory between here and Ogden better than I do. If you're willing to ride that stretch and ask around quietly about a man named Harlan Voss, that would be useful. Jonas straightened. I'll leave tomorrow morning. Don't tell Clara you're doing it. Why not? Because she'll insist on coming with you, and I need her here. Jonas looked at him for a long moment. Something in the older man's face shifted, not quite a smile, not quite relief. Something between them that was more complicated than either. He said, You need her here. Caleb said, Don't make it more than I said. I'm not making it anything. Jonas turned his horse. I'll send word from Ogden. He rode. Caleb stood in the yard until the sound of hooves faded. He went inside. Clara was at the table with the marshal's letter spread open in front of her, and a piece of paper beside it where she'd been making notes in her clean, direct hand. Dates, amounts, names, the sequence of every interaction she'd had with the agency from the first letter to the last. Building testimony, organizing evidence, doing the work of preparing her own case with the same systematic efficiency she brought to the stock records and the barn maintenance and everything else. He sat across from her. She didn't look up immediately. He said, Jonas was here. She looked up then. He told her what Jonas had said. Not all of it, not the part about her losing everything. She knew that already. He told her what Jonas had offered and what he'd agreed to. She put her pen down. You sent him to Ogden. I asked him to look around, quietly, without telling me. I'm telling you now. She looked at him for a long moment. He held the look, because this was one he'd learned to hold, the one where she was deciding whether to push back or accept the decision. She said, "Did you know I would be upset about it? I knew you'd prefer to have been consulted." "Then why didn't you?" He said, "Because I made a judgment call. Jonas is 60 years old and knows that territory and owes you a debt he can't pay any other way right now. You sending him feels different from me sending him. I thought it would be cleaner this way." He paused. "If I was wrong, tell me." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You weren't wrong," and picked up her pen. He watched her go back to her notes. The fire settled. Outside the ridge, wind moved across the east wall. He thought about Jonas saying, "I need her here," and about himself saying, "Don't make it more than I said," and about the fact that Jonas had looked at him and said it anyway. He said, "Clara." She looked up. He said, "After Salt Lake City. After all of this is over, what do you want?" She put the pen down again. She looked at him the way she looked at a problem she had been avoiding. She said, "What do you mean? When the hearing is done and the case is resolved and your testimony is given." He kept his voice level the way you keep your voice level when you're asking something that matters. "What do you want then?" she said. "That's a very large question." "I know. You're asking me to think past Salt Lake City when I'm still managing what's in front of me." "I know that too." She looked down at her notes, then back at him. "I want—" She stopped, started again. "I want a place that is mine. I have not had that, not truly. The boarding house room wasn't mine. Chicago wasn't mine. The life I built there was good, but it was provisional, always provisional." She paused. "I want something that doesn't feel like it could be taken away if the circumstances changed." He said, "What would that look like?" She looked at him steadily. "You know what it would look like, Caleb." He said, "Yes, I do." Neither of them said the next thing. It was there fully present in the room between them, and they both knew it, and neither of them reached for it yet, because the ground between where they stood and where that thing lived still needed crossing carefully. But they both knew the direction. 3 days later, everything changed. Jonas's wire came into Clearwater at noon, and Sheriff Pratt sent a deputy out to the ridge with it, which told Caleb before he opened it that it was not a routine update. He read it at the gate with the deputy waiting. He read it twice. Then he went inside and found Clara in the barn and said, "Come inside, now." She came. She read his face on the way in, and by the time he put the wire on the table, she was already sitting, already braced. He sat across from her and said, "Harlan Voss is not in Ogden. Jonas found 3 people who knew of him. He left Utah Territory 2 weeks ago." He paused. "They believe he went east. But one of Jonas's contacts, a freighter who runs between Ogden and Salt Lake, said Voss made inquiries before he left. About Clearwater." Clara said, "About Clearwater." "And the road to Mercer Ridge." The kitchen was completely still. She said, "He knows I'm here." "Apparently." She said, "Why would he come here? The criminal proceeding is going to happen regardless of whether I testify. Without your testimony, the case against him is weaker. The other women can speak to what they were promised and what they paid. But you're the one who actually traveled. You're the one the agency used as proof their service was real. Your testimony ties their fraud to their correspondence operation in a way the others can't." He held her gaze. "If you don't testify, their lawyer argues there was no fraudulent intent, just mismanagement." She said, "He's coming here to threaten me, or to offer you money to withdraw from the proceedings. Or both." "Or both," he agreed. She was quiet for a moment. He watched her face do the thing it did, go very still and very focused. The anger folded down into something cooler and more useful. She said, "Then we don't wait for him to come to us." He said, "What do you mean?" "I mean, we ride to Salt Lake City now. Not in 6 weeks. Now." She looked at him with absolute clarity. "If Voss is moving toward us, the safest place for me is in front of a federal hearing officer with the marshal's investigators already assembled. He can't threaten what he can't reach." He said, The hearing isn't scheduled. I'll request an emergency deposition. The letter from the marshal's investigator included his direct contact at the Salt Lake office. She stood. If they have enough to charge Voss federally, they'll want my deposition immediately. They won't make me wait 6 weeks if I tell them Voss is heading this direction. He stood. How long to prepare? 1 day. I'll wire Hector Reyes tonight about the cattle, and I'll write to the investigator. She was already moving toward the table toward her paper and pen, the same focused efficiency she brought to everything. Caleb. He stopped. She said without turning. I need you to understand something. He waited. She said, I am not running because I'm afraid of Harlan Voss. She turned to face him. I'm going to Salt Lake City because it is the smartest move available to me, and because I intend to stand in front of that hearing officer and say everything I know and make sure those 62 women get back what was taken from them. Her voice was very quiet and very certain. That is the reason I am going. Not fear. He looked at her. This woman who had arrived on his porch in the rain holding a lie with both hands and had turned it piece by piece into something else entirely. He said, I know. She said, do you? He said, Clara. From the first morning you were here, I have not once thought of you as someone who needed protecting from the truth of a situation. He paused. What I want to do is stand next to you, not in front of you, next to you. Something in her face opened just slightly, the way a door opens when the latch finally releases after a long time of resistance. She said, then get your coat. He almost smiled. It surprised him, the almost smile, the way it moved through him, without his permission, unfamiliar as something rediscovered in the back of a drawer. He got his coat. They left the next afternoon with the horses saddled and a week's supplies and the marshal's wire confirming an emergency deposition date in Salt Lake City in 4 days. Pratt's deputy had ridden the road out to the junction and reported nothing unusual, but Caleb rode the first hour with his rifle across his saddle and his eyes on the tree line, and Clara rode beside him without comment. An hour out from the ridge, she said, I've been thinking about something you asked me. He said, which thing? What I want, after. He kept his eyes on the road. And, she said, I want to come back here. The words were simple. She said them the way she said most important things, directly, without ornament, in the voice of someone who has thought it through completely and is now simply reporting a conclusion. He said, to Mercer Ridge. Yes. He said, why? She looked at him with the expression she wore when she thought a question was unnecessary, but was willing to answer it anyway. She said, because in 3 weeks on that ridge, I have felt more settled than I have felt anywhere since I was a child, and didn't know yet that things could be taken from you. She paused. And because the ranch needs 2 people, I think you know that. He said, I've managed alone for 18 years. I know. And look at the state of the roof. A pause. And the stock records. And the east fence line. He said, are you criticizing my ranch management? I am stating observable facts about your ranch management. He said, the roof was on my list. It was on your list for how long? A pause. 2 winters. She made a small sound. 2 winters. It was structurally sound. It was aspirationally sound. She looked at him. Caleb, you needed help, not rescue help. There is a difference, and you know it. He said, I know the difference. Then stop arguing with the conclusion. He rode in silence for a moment. Then he said, the spare room is too small. She looked at him sharply. He said very deliberately, looking at the road ahead. If you're going to be on the ranch properly, the arrangement ought to be proper, which means a conversation I am not prepared to have on horseback 3 miles from Clearwater. She was quiet for a long, precise moment. Then she said, all right. He said, all right. They rode. The sky above the territory was that particular blue, cold and wide and clear, and the road stretched ahead of them toward Salt Lake City and a federal hearing and a man named Harlan Voss, who had made a significant miscalculation in deciding to come looking for Clara Whitfield. Because Clara Whitfield was not, as it had turned out, the kind of woman who waited to be found. She was the kind who rode out to meet whatever was coming and made sure she got there first. And for the first time in 18 years, Caleb Mercer was not riding alone. The weight of that, the simple physical, undeniable fact of another person beside him on this road, settled into his chest the way something settles when it belongs exactly where it has landed. He did not say anything about it. He didn't need to. She was already there. They rode into Salt Lake City on the third evening, and the city felt like a different world from Mercer Ridge. Louder, faster, full of the particular noise of people who had places to be, and didn't question why. Caleb had not been in a city this size in years, and he felt the edges of it pressing against him, the way crowds always had, too much happening in too many directions at once. Clara rode beside him without flinching. She had been in cities. She knew how to move through them. At the hotel, a respectable establishment, the marshal's investigator had recommended in his wire, she signed the register under her own name, Clara Whitfield, without hesitation. The clerk looked at Caleb. Caleb said, "Mercer, separate room." The clerk gave them rooms on the same floor at either end of the hall, and Caleb carried both traveling bags up the stairs without being asked, set hers outside her door, and said, "The investigator's office is expecting us at 8 in the morning." She said, "I know. I wrote the wire." He said, "Get some sleep." She looked at him with the particular expression she wore when he said something she found both unnecessary and oddly considerate. She said, "You too." He didn't sleep much. He lay on the hotel bed and listened to the sounds of the city through the wall, and thought about Harlan Voss, about the road they'd traveled, about the east fence line on the ranch that still needed 2 more posts set before winter came down hard. He thought about the conversation they hadn't finished on horseback outside Clearwater, the one about the spare room and proper arrangements, and the sentence he'd left deliberately incomplete. He thought about what it meant to want something again after 18 years of wanting nothing. It felt dangerous. That was the honest truth of it. Not dangerous the way Voss was dangerous, not the threat of a man who had reason to want Clara silent. Dangerous the way standing on the edge of something irreversible was dangerous. The way you stood at the top of a steep grade and understood that once you started down it, there was no going back to where you'd been. He had been standing at the top of that grade since the morning she'd said, "I want to come back here." Maybe longer. Maybe since the night she'd sat up with the sick heifer, and he'd crouched beside her in the barn and said, "You don't have to do everything alone." He got up before dawn and went downstairs and drank bad hotel coffee and waited for morning to arrive. The marshal's investigator was a compact, precise man named Aldridge, who had the manner of someone who had conducted enough interviews to stop being impressed by complexity and start being impressed only by clarity. He shook Caleb's hand, shook Clara's, and led them into a small office with a stenographer in the corner and a stack of files on the desk that represented apparently 8 months of investigation into the Fairfield Domestic Agency. He said to Clara, "Miss Whitfield, thank you for coming early. Your wire indicated a possible threat from Harlan Voss moving toward your location in Utah Territory." Clara said, "That's correct. We have second-hand intelligence that he made inquiries about the road to Mercer Ridge approximately 10 days ago and left Utah Territory heading east shortly after." Aldridge said, "We've been tracking Voss since last month. We believe he's currently in Denver." He opened a file. "We have a federal warrant for his arrest pending the deposition testimony. Once we have your statement on record, we can move on him regardless of where he surfaces." Clara said, "Then let's not waste time." Aldridge looked at her for a moment with something that might have been appreciation in a man who allowed himself such expressions. He opened his ledger. "Let's begin." Caleb sat against the wall and listened to her give her testimony, and it was one of the most precise things he had ever witnessed. She did not editorialize. She did not dramatize. She laid out facts in sequence, dates, amount-specific representations the agency had made, the exact language of the guarantee they'd given for the placement fund, with the same systematic efficiency she brought to the stock ledger. The stenographer's pen moved fast and didn't stop. When Aldridge asked about the correspondence that had brought her to Utah territory, she explained the situation. Factually, the letter had been written by a third party without the named recipient's knowledge. The agency had used her legitimate placement as evidence of their service's validity, and she had discovered the fraud upon arrival. Aldridge said, "And the third party who wrote the letter, do you intend to name him in testimony?" Clara said, "No." Aldridge looked at her. "Miss Whitfield, if the agency used your placement to legitimize, the agency's fraud does not require his name to be prosecuted," she said evenly. "What the agency did with my placement was their choice, not his. He wrote a letter he had no right to write. He did not participate in a financial fraud scheme. Those are separate matters, and I will not conflate them." Aldridge was quiet for a moment. He said, "That's your final position?" "It is." He made a note. "All right." Caleb looked at his hands in his lap and said nothing. She had just protected Jonas Miller from a federal investigator without being asked. She had done it precisely and without softening the acknowledgement of what Jonas had done wrong. He thought, "She is the most exact person I have ever met." He thought, "I have no idea what I did to deserve being in the same room with her." The deposition took 3 hours. When it was done, Aldridge closed his ledger and said, "This is the strongest testimony we have in this case. I want you to know that." Clara said, "What happens to the women who paid into the fund? If the prosecution is successful, and with your deposition, I believe it will be, the court will order restitution from the liquidated assets of the solicitor's accounts. Every woman who can be located and verified will receive repayment." He paused. "Including you." Clara said, "Use mine for the ones who need it more." Aldridge looked at her. "You're entitled to—" "I'm aware of what I'm entitled to." She stood. "I'm telling you what I want done with it. Find the women who can't afford to wait for the court's timetable. Use it there." Aldridge said after a moment, "I'll note your preference in the record." She shook his hand. "Thank you, Mr. Aldridge." She turned and walked to the door, and Caleb stood and followed her, and they were in the hallway before he said quietly, "You just gave away your restitution." She said, "I know what I did. That was most of what you had." "I have a roof over my head," she said. "A structurally sound one now." The ghost of something crossed her face. "Most of those women don't." He walked beside her down the hall. He said, "Clara." She stopped. He said, "I need to say something, and I need you to let me finish before you respond." She turned to face him. Her expression was careful and open. He said, "You have been on my ranch for 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks you have fixed things. I left broken for 2 years, organized records I was losing money on, and saved a heifer that would have cost me badly in spring. You have done all of it without being asked and without expecting anything in return." He paused. "You just gave away the money those men owed you to women who needed it more, which is the most Clara Whitfield thing you have ever done." Another pause. "I want you to come back to Mercer Ridge. Not as a boarder, not as a hired hand. I want you to come back because it is your home if you want it to be, and because I am asking you not with a letter someone else wrote, and not out of obligation. I am asking you directly right now in this hallway, as clearly as I know how to say anything." She looked at him. The hallway was empty. Somewhere below them, the city was making its city sounds, but up here, it was just the two of them, and the thing that had been building since the first morning. She'd made cornbread without being asked. She said, "Are you asking me to marry you, Caleb Mercer?" He said yes. She said, "In a hotel hallway in Salt Lake City." He said, "I told you I don't know how to be hospitable." Something broke open in her face. Not tears, not laughter, but the thing between them. Some quality of held breath released all at once, and she looked at him with those dark eyes that had been tired when she arrived and were not tired anymore. Not in the same way tired now, in the way of someone who has carried something a long way and has finally found the place to set it down. She said, "Yes." He said, "Yes." She said, "I just said yes, Caleb. Don't make me repeat it." He said, "All right." She said, All right. They stood in the hallway for a moment, and he was aware of his own heartbeat in a way he hadn't been aware of it in years. Aware of himself as something living, something that could want and be wanted, something that had not finished yet after all. He put his hand out. Not to shake hers. Just put it out open between them. She looked at it. Then she put her hand in his. He held it for a moment, and neither of them said anything, and it was the simplest thing that had happened between them, and also somehow the largest. Then she said, "We should find a judge before we leave the city." He said, "Today. Is there a reason to wait?" He thought about it. "No. Then today." She started walking, his hand still in hers, pulling him slightly along. "I am not traveling back to that ranch unmarried and having that conversation with Jonas Miller about my sleeping arrangements." He said, "You're worried about Jonas Miller's opinion of your sleeping arrangements." "I'm worried about his expression," she said. "The man is insufferably satisfied with himself already. I will not give him additional material," Caleb said. "He's going to be insufferably satisfied regardless." "I know," she said, "but I'd like to limit the scope of it." He said very quietly, almost to himself, "He's going to say he was right." She glanced at him sideways. Was he? He thought about January. About Jonas riding home in the dark and telling his wife that Caleb was going to die out there, not from cold and not from accident. About the specific desperation of a man who had watched his friend disappear for 18 years and ran out of patience with doing nothing. He said, about the outcome, not about the method. She said, "That's fair." A pause. "Caleb." "Yes. When we get back to the ridge, I want us to go through the ranch together, properly. Every fence line, every structure, every head of livestock. I want to know what we're working with." He said, "We." She said, "I just agreed to marry you." "We." He said, "The east fence needs 2 posts before winter." "I know. I noted it in the ledger." "There's a section of the barn roof." "Also noted." He said, "You noted roof damage in my barn ledger." "I note everything. You'll get used to it." He said, "I think I already have." She squeezed his hand once briefly and let go, because they were coming out into the street now, and there was a city to navigate, and Clara Whitfield, soon to be. Clara Mercer had never in her life needed to hold on to something to know it was there. They were married that afternoon by a territorial judge named Holloway, who had a white beard and a dry manner, and who read the vows with the efficiency of a man who had done this many times and did not believe in unnecessary flourish. When it was done, he said, "You may kiss your bride, Mr. Mercer," the way a man says a thing he is required by custom to say. Caleb looked at Clara. Clara looked at him. He kissed her, not dramatically, not with performance, just firmly and briefly, the way a man kisses a woman when he means it, and doesn't feel the need to announce it. The judge's clerk, a young woman of about 20, looked up from her paperwork and sighed. The judge stamped the certificate. Caleb signed it. Clara signed it. The clerk signed it as witness. Clara picked up the certificate and folded it and put it in her coat pocket with the care she gave to all important documents. She said, "All right." He said, "All right." They walked out into the street as man and wife and the city continued around them exactly as it had before, indifferent and loud, and Caleb thought that was exactly right, that the most important things happened in the spaces the world wasn't paying attention to. The wire from Aldridge reached them at the hotel the following morning before they'd finished breakfast. Harlan Voss had been apprehended in Denver the previous evening, found at a hotel under a false name, arrested on the federal warrant. He had not reached Utah territory. He had never gotten close. Clara read the wire and set it on the breakfast table and drank her coffee. Caleb said, "How do you feel?" She said, "Like I would have preferred he tried to come to the ridge." He looked at her. She said, "Because then I'd have had the opportunity to demonstrate that the rifle skills I mentioned to Sheriff Pratt were not an exaggeration." She picked up her coffee cup. "But I am also relieved that 62 women will get their money back, and that man will spend the next several years explaining himself to a federal court. So, she drank, satisfied. He said, "We can head back today." She said, "After breakfast." He said, "After breakfast." They left Salt Lake City in the early afternoon with the sky clear and cold, and the road running west and north toward home. Home. He had been calling it that for 18 years, without it feeling like the word meant what it was supposed to mean. It had been a location, a function. The place where the cattle were, and the fences were, and the silence was. He tried the word now in his mind with her riding beside him on the road home, and it meant something entirely different. He said, "When we get back." She said, "I want to take down the wall between the spare room and the main room. Make the space larger." He kept his eyes on the road. "It was always too small. I built it wrong the first time." She said, "That sounds like a two-person job." "It is." "Then we'll do it together." He said, "It'll take a week probably. We'll need to shore up the beam." She said, "I know how to shore up a beam." He said, "I know you do." She said, "Caleb." "Yes. Stop being surprised by what I know how to do." He said, "I'm not surprised. I'm—" He paused, looking for the word. "Grateful." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "So am I." They rode. Jonas Miller was in the yard when they came up the road to Mercer Ridge 2 days later, sitting on the fence post with his hat on and his hands in his coat pockets, and Caleb would have bet money that he had been receiving updates from Hector Reyes about their expected return and had timed his arrival accordingly. Clara saw him and said under her breath, "Insufferable." Caleb said, "Completely." They rode into the yard and dismounted, and Jonas looked at them both, and then at their hands, and then at Caleb's face, and his expression did the thing Caleb had predicted it would do, the particular expression of a man who has waited a very long time to be proven right, and is now savoring the arrival of the moment. He said, "Well." Caleb said, "Don't." Jonas said, "I'm just saying well. I'm just—" Clara handed her reins to Caleb without looking at Jonas, and said, "Mr. Miller, before you say whatever you are preparing to say, I want to be clear about something." Jonas looked at her with the wary attention of a man who has learned in recent weeks that this woman's clarity was something to take seriously. She said, "What you did was wrong. I have not changed my position on that, and I will not." He said, "I know. The fact that it produced an outcome neither of us predicted does not retroactively make it right." "I know that too." "Good." She looked at him steadily. "Now, Caleb tells me you've been a friend to him for 31 years, which means you are by extension someone I should probably know properly." She paused. "So I'll put the coffee on, and you can come inside and meet me as a person, rather than as a consequence of your actions, if you're willing to make that distinction." Jonas looked at Caleb. Caleb said, "I'd say yes." Jonas turned back to Clara. He said, "Miss Whitfield." She said, "Mrs. Mercer." A beat of silence. Something moved through Jonas's face. Something that was not simple satisfaction, not the insufferable smugness Caleb had predicted, but something deeper and more complicated. Something that looked a lot like what a man feels when he has done a wrong thing for the right reason, and the universe has, against all reasonable expectation, been kind about the outcome. His eyes went bright, just briefly. He said, "Mrs. Mercer." She said, "The coffee will be ready in 10 minutes." And went inside. Jonas stood in the yard. Caleb took the horses to the barn without saying anything. Jonas followed after a moment and stood in the barn doorway while Caleb unsaddled. Jonas said, "How was Salt Lake City?" "Efficient." "The hearing?" "Done. Voss was arrested in Denver. The women will get their restitution." "And Clara?" "She gave her restitution to the ones who needed it more." Jonas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She did." "Don't say anything." "I'm not saying anything." "You're thinking it very loudly." Jonas was quiet for another moment. Then carefully, "Caleb, I am going to say one thing, and then I will not say it again, and you can be angry at me for it if you need to be." Caleb kept working. Say it. I'm sorry for how I did it. I will always be sorry for how I did it. A pause. But I am not sorry that she's here. Caleb set the saddle over the rail. He stood with his back to Jonas for a moment. He said, I'm not sorry either. Jonas said nothing. Caleb said, But you are never going to do anything like that again, to me or to anyone. No, Jonas said, I'm not. Good. He turned and picked up the feed buckets. Jonas said, She's going to be a formidable woman to be married to. Caleb said, I know. You're prepared for that. Caleb thought about 3 weeks of her fixing things he'd left broken, and noting roof damage in his barn ledger, and sitting up at 2 a.m. with a sick heifer, and delivering testimony to a federal investigator with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime preparing for exactly that kind of moment. He thought about her standing in the hotel hallway saying, I just said yes, don't make me repeat it. He thought about the certificate folded in her coat pocket, carried with the same care she gave to everything important. He said, I've been surviving alone for 18 years. I think I can manage being alive next to her. Jonas was quiet for a moment. Then he said very quietly, Good. That's good, Caleb. Caleb picked up the buckets and went to feed the cattle, and Jonas went inside for the coffee Clara had made, and the ridge wind came across the east side of the barn, the way it always had, the same as it had for 18 years, unchanged and constant. Everything else was different. That evening, after Jonas had gone home with Margaret's pot, returned clean, and a handshake from Caleb that meant more than either of them said out loud. Clara stood at the window of the cabin in the last light and looked at the ridge. Caleb was at the table with the stock ledger, the updated one, her version with the color-coded notations he'd initially found unnecessary and had come to rely on completely. He looked up. She said, the east fence. He said, tomorrow. She said, and the barn roof section over the third stall. Also tomorrow. She said, we'll need timber from Clearwater before we can do the wall. I'll ride Friday. She turned from the window and looked at him across the room, and the lantern light was warm, and the stove had been going since late afternoon, and the cabin was the temperature it was supposed to be, which it had not been with the consistency it should have been for years before she'd adjusted the damper on the second day she was here. He said, Clara. She said, He said, the photograph, She looked at the shelf by the window. The small framed portrait of Ellie was there, same as it had always been, same as it had been on the first day Clara arrived, and looked at it and set it back in exactly the right place. He said, I'd like to keep it there. She said, I know. He said, is that Caleb? Her voice was gentle and certain. Of course it stays. She was your wife. She was part of what made you who you are. She looked at the photograph for a moment. I don't want a version of you that didn't love her. That's not the man I married. He said nothing. There was nothing adequate to say. She looked back at him. But I am also here, and I am not a guest, and I am not a mistake, and I am not a temporary arrangement. She held his gaze. I am your wife, and this is my home. He said, yes. She said, and the spare room wall is coming down Friday. He said, Thursday if we get the timber Wednesday. She said, Wednesday then. She came to the table and sat across from him and picked up the pen he'd set down, and she made a note in the ledger, Timber Wednesday, Clearwater, in her clean, direct hand. He watched her write it. He thought about January and Jonas riding home through the dark and the specific weight of 18 years of silence accumulating in a room until the room itself forgot what it had been built for. He thought about a knock at the wrong door. He thought about a woman standing in the rain, holding a lie with both hands, and how that lie had been the last true thing between them. The last untrue thing, rather, because everything after it had been real. Every word, every morning, every hour in the barn, every silence that was shared instead of solitary. She set the pen down and looked at the ledger. She said, we'll need to buy 2 more heifers before spring if you want to grow the herd the way the records suggest you should. He said, I know. She said, I have opinions about the breed. He said, I assumed you did. She said, do you want to hear them? He looked at her across the table. This woman who had arrived on a storm-soaked evening, holding a letter he'd never written, who had turned his broken, silent, deliberately diminished life into something that resembled what it had always been intended to be. And he thought that he could listen to her opinions about cattle breeds for the rest of his life, and not once wish the conversation were shorter. He said, tell me. And she did. And outside the ridge held the last of the daylight, the way it always had, indifferent and steady and unchanged. While inside the cabin that had been silent for 18 years, two people sat at a table and made plans for spring. He had not received a wife by mistake. He had received a second life through one, and this time he intended to live it all the way to the end.